In case you are new to the high leverage practices, I just wanted to provide one broad overview idea and that of what the high leverage practices are. So they were developed in partnership with the Cedar Center and CEC. They are organized around four major areas: collaboration, assessment, and then today's two areas are social emotional behavioral HLPs and instructional HLPs. In total, there are 22 HLPs that we know help support students with disabilities that we recommend states and districts and EPP programs try to emphasize and anchor their curriculum in. And so first up, I turn it over to my dear colleague Day, because we're going to start with the social, emotional, behavioral HLPs.
So those of you who are familiar with the HLPs, or those of you who are newer to those, the four under the social, emotional, and behavioral umbrella include establishing a consistent, organized, respectful learning environment, providing constructive and positive feedback, teaching social behavior, and conducting functional behavioral assessment. The good news is when I think about these four items, like I do with most of the other HLPs, I really identify intersecting spaces with how we talk about these in our ed prep programs, how we support our existing teachers in establishing these types of constructs in their classroom. So this one for me, the social, emotional, and behavioral one, tends to be one that, especially for my teacher candidates, tends to be a little bit more accessible in terms of their entry point to these HLPs. So you can go to the next one and we'll talk specifically about the learning environment. So what we'll do for this section is just sort of talk about an overview or a definition of the HLPs, each of the HLPs, and then provide a couple strategies or some examples of what these look like. The other thing I will say about the social, emotional, and behavioral HLPs is that this does tend to be a place where we have some opportunities for interpretation about what is a organized learning environment, or what does feedback look like that guides student learning. And so it's really important to, when you're working with your target audience, to really operationalize these constructs so that depending on your environment, it's clear what consistent and organized looks like. Because in some places that could vary based on the grade or the age or the content and the amount of movement that happens. So really making sure that with each of these, there's sort of an operational anchor that helps you have a conversation about what this would look like. But an overview is just thinking about making sure that what's happening is age appropriate, that the expectations are culturally responsive, and that ultimately leads to a positive relationship or interaction between the children and the teacher, the children and each other, or even the adults in the space. And of course, decreasing challenging behavior. So some strategies that might come into play here are the things that I think of when I think about PBIS, which includes teaching, reinforcing, and reteaching expectations, particularly after a break, or being proactive and helping students plan for a change or disruption in the schedule so that those structures are there and we can provide the necessary scaffolding to make sure that if there are changes or disruptions, that we're providing the support that students might need in order to be successful, even when a change happens. Another way that we can connect this, as we've talked about before, the HLPs intersect in so many ways. So another way to think about establishing this learning environment are the ways to collaborate with the other adults in the space. So if you're in a co-taught environment or an environment where collaboration happens often, really working together with a person with whom you collaborate to have a common language and a common idea about establish this respectful learning environment. So on the next one, we'll look at providing positive and constructive feedback to guide students' learning and the behavior. So effective feedback relates to students' goals and guides their learning and behavior, and it increases their motivation, their engagement, and their independence, which is ultimately our goal for learners, is that they can operate in their spaces independently, or to the extent that they're able to operate with support or what may or may not be necessary for them. Some strategies that we can offer to you all around providing constructive and positive feedback are things like utilizing peer support strategies. So how can students help one another? How can learners pay attention to one another and give each other feedback? Creating coaching opportunities so that teachers can help students increase their positive and constructive opportunities. And then thinking about a formula where we acknowledge effort and then tell the student what we want to see. The next slide has a few examples of different types of feedback. So we certainly would want to encourage pairing positive and corrective, or positive and proactive feedback. So really affirming that when students are working hard, and then offering some reminders about how they could practice something next time, or offering some correction instead of pushing, say, excuse me. Those might be some ways that you could provide the feedback that is both positive and corrective at the same time, and creates opportunities or acknowledges successive approximations of behavior, particularly when students are taking up new things or when they're in a new environment, and opportunities to make errors might be high, but really acknowledging their effort and acknowledging the ways that we've seen them be productive.
Right. So HLP 9 is all about teaching social behaviors. And this is the idea that we must explicitly teach appropriate interpersonal skills such as communication, self-management, how to engage with peers, and then prompt and reinforce. So, this is the old idea that, students should just come to school ready and know how to be socially appropriate. And we can't always, take for granted that that is actually true, that we as educators need to be helping students navigate these social situations and their social behaviors. And just like academics, where you would, prompt and reinforce students for, let's say, giving the right answer to a math problem, you want to prompt and reinforce when students are demonstrating appropriate social behaviors. One of the most impactful things that I ever learned was that behavior is a form of communication. So when a student is displaying some misbehavior or challenging behaviors, it's usually not because they're just trying to be jerks. They're communicating some kind of need, or that one of their needs is not being met. And so we want to, it's always good to approach a challenging behavior situation with this idea of curiosity, and that it's again not a personality trait of the student, but that there's most likely an underlying skill deficit that just needs to be addressed and taught. Always great when we have schools and districts, using some kind of broad school-wide expectations around behavior. This is when models of like PBIS and MTSS really come into play, but always good to be aligning those social and emotional goals with larger school-wide expectations, and to be thinking about embedding social skills instruction across academic subjects. So of course, there are some great social skills curricula out there that I know even my own girls, once a week with the counselor at the school, they do a social skill curriculum. And so it's fine to have it as a standalone part of the day, but it's also very effective to just embed those social skills during academic subjects. And here, of course, a key idea is to collaborate with key stakeholders, people who also have training and expertise in social and emotional needs of students, like social workers, psychologists, counselors, et cetera, to consult with them about how might be the best way to approach a student's needs. And then, to really be thinking about social skill groups for kiddos. So just some quick steps for teaching social skills. Really, it's not unlike many other academic skills we might be trying to communicate for students, but you want to think about who are the students who could benefit from this instruction, and then define what the target social skill will be. We really want to break those skills down into teachable steps. So again, the idea that a student just knows how to walk into a classroom in a respectful way and begin to do what's expected of them in that classroom. There were probably 10 smaller skills and steps involved in that expectation. And so it's important to break it down into the smaller skills that students can be taught and again, then reinforced for doing the right thing. Always great to use relevant examples, including non-examples. And particularly for social skills instruction, role-playing scenarios are so helpful where kids can actually role play their feelings or how someone's behavior might impact someone else. So a great way to facilitate that. You can use strategic instruction. Again, just like other areas that you're trying to teach, you want to provide performance feedback and using, some of those great kinds of specific feedback that Day was talking about just a few slides ago. Again, the idea that children also need guided practice. They actually have to practice these things and with the right scaffolded support. And then again, we want to work on maintenance and generalization that, if you are teaching a child how to appropriately communicate during morning meeting time, we want to help generalize that to also the lunch table, to also recess. So just some ideas here that you can focus on when you are trying to develop those social skills. HLP 10, the last one of the social emotional behavioral ones, is all about conducting a functional behavioral assessment, FBA, to then develop an individual student behavior support plan. Many people refer to these as BIPs, behavior intervention plans. And the broad idea here is that when a student has inappropriate behaviors that are chronic, intense, are really impeding learning, you want to approach this from a functional standpoint where you're evaluating the function of the behavior and to develop a plan to teach and reinforce replacement behaviors. So rather than running in the hallway, what would be a better behavior to engage in and then reinforce that? Now, FBAs are more intense, so we often think of these as needs for students. Again, if you're operating from a PBIS or MTSS framework, these are often students who might have tier 3 kinds of behavior needs. So conducting that functional behavioral assessment is a great data collection tool to help identify ways to support that student. This often requires a team, including a special educator or general educator, a behavior specialist, social worker, etc. And an important thing here is that you want to regularly be collecting progress monitoring data to inform the plan. It's not just a one and done kind of process. And so you want to be taking data on how things that you are introducing into the environment might be changing or influencing students' behavior. Again, here it's really focusing on the controllable environment. So, I think this is a really important thing to emphasize with teacher candidates. And that is, as educators, we can really only control what happens in our environment at school. And so by focusing more on that an environmental aspect, I think it's been helpful to move away from, blaming parents or families. Oh, well, this kid has behavior problems because his mom and dad don't, spend time with him at home. Whether or not that's true or not really is irrelevant to educators in terms of we can only account for the time that students are with us in schools. And so really to be thinking about how can we set up that supportive environment. And then to always recognize and celebrate major, but also minor successes. That's really going to help students make progress if they do have some behavioral goals that they're working on. We're going to jump ahead to number 15. Dave, do you want to do this one?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in there.
Okay.
So 15 provides scaffolded supports. So the overview for this one is providing temporary assistance to students so that they can complete tasks they cannot yet do independently with a high rate of success. And so this is very much, as I said before, about this idea of how the HLPs are intersecting. You know, we think about scaffolding and we think about helping our students in learning. Learning is risky. And so one way to be able to complete something that feels risky or new is to have help. And so really thinking about when we're supporting HLP 15, I think a lot about planning. So what are the ways when our candidates or when our teachers are planning instruction? What are the ways that they're thinking about gradually releasing their students to do things independently? So are they providing verbal supports or written supports? Are they providing flexibility on how students engage in an activity? Are they able to give in advance rubrics or graphic organizers that helps give students an opportunity to see how information is either grouped together, how things are related, to really give them a structure in making connections make on their own. So providing scaffolded supports is critical, again, not just in, even though this is one of the instructional HLPs, this really has generalization across a social and an academic context. Another way for students who require more physical supports are hand over hand support, actually physically stepping in and, you know, guiding their hands in doing an activity, sorting, writing. I have a 5-year-old, so we do a lot of support in helping him even learn how to write his name and hold his pencil, you know, so those kinds of things. Using training wheels is an excellent example. Making sure that not only is it support that's there, but support that the students can feel, because that is how, you know, you feel comfortable taking the risk. Number 16, I think, was our second one, which is explicit instruction. One of my faves, of course. You know, yay! I do, we do, you do. And so making content and skills explicit by showing and telling the students how to think through problems, really enacting strategies, clarifying concepts. Sometimes I see new teachers, particularly in my teacher candidates, rehearsing a narrative that if they demonstrate it, that the students will copy them. And in some ways, that's what you want them to do. They need a model that is an accurate model and that's an effective model so that they have a reference point, you know? And this also goes back to that idea of scaffolding. So how are you gradually releasing the responsibility or the opportunity to practice to the student? And explicit instruction really provides us with a set of steps that embeds that gradual release to make sure that students have the support that they can feel, like it's a model what I see you do, and then some practice that is errorless in many instances until they're able to get to the point where they can practice something where potential error can happen, but we provide them with that feedback right away, kind of connecting us back up to our HLPs a little earlier. So the intersections just don't ever end.
I love that point, Day, that you made. When you use explicit instruction, at least initially, the idea is that kids generally don't make errors, or there's very few. So they're not learning things incorrectly, and you're not inadvertently creating frustration for them, particularly like kids who might need support from the social, emotional, behavioral. You don't want them to check out from instruction because they got something wrong. So really, I think, I don't know. I'm sure I'm not allowed to have a favorite of the 22 HLPs, but this one might be right up there at the top.
It's my fave.
Okay, I think then we will go to number 20. Oh, see, all these great ideas, but providing intensive instruction. Okay, and actually we often hear in the field, people talk about intensive explicit instruction, that, you know, this idea that we want the instruction to be right exactly what students need, so we don't have a lot of wasted time. That it's systematically designed based on student data. So the intensity of the instruction matches students' needs and their and it's individualized. So I often, I think can tell when you go in a classroom and the teacher has really got the intensive instruction down. It's like there's still a warm, very supportive feeling, but, getting into the idea of routines and, there's not a minute wasted, the instruction and the examples and even the problems or the activities that teachers have students do, it's all very purposeful in an attempt to provide high quality practice for that student. It's all about this data-based individualization to support students. Really just this idea that oftentimes, I've heard a lot of my pre-service teachers will say things like, when I'm like, oh, well, how should we be supporting students with disabilities instructionally or academically? And a lot of times they say, oh, we have to go really slow and we have to back up and all of this. And yes, some students may need instruction to be a little slower, but it's less about the pace and more about what you do with the time. Sure, we have to go a lot slower if we're not providing instruction that's at the right level for that student. But we also, with kids with disabilities who are often, academically may already be behind, we don't have a minute to waste. In fact, in some ways, we got to kind of ramp up their instruction to help them meet those grade level expectations. And that means, when you do a math lesson, why am I having this student practice this particular problem? Oh, it's because I actually want to see if they've understood this skill, as opposed to just randomly pulling math problems out of a textbook. This is also the idea that making sure, again, with a tiered system of support, this kind of naturally fits in there, that some students may need some tier 2 supports where the instruction is a little bit more intensive, or maybe it's focused, there is a particular skill that they need more practice in. So we're going to give them, 20 minutes a day of really devoted time to working on that skill, because we really want to help make sure that they are successful. And by the time they, get to be 12th graders or at that post secondary level, that they're ready to go on and meet those college and career ready standards.
In this situation, though, the data are the key,
Yeah.
making sure that those decisions are based on the data that are in real time, that are on the day, are really important, because without it, you're not able to make decisions that are accurate for the student in the moment, in the lesson and in the activity.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so that was 3. I actually think, Dave, maybe I could do the next one. We have a few more minutes. So I think, okay, let's teach students to maintain and generalize new learning across time and settings. So this is the idea that we want to ensure that students can apply concepts across multiple settings. And so this can mean systematically use of schedules of reinforcement and teach skills that are naturally reinforced outside of the classroom. Again, the idea that we want to make sure that we brought this up with the social HLPs, that, if you teach a behavior in one setting, students should be able to generalize it to another setting, that they don't have this idea that I only do this particular behavior because it's the reading time of my day or it's morning meeting. And that also students can maintain learning over time, that you are making sure that they, once you stop emphasizing a skill, that they all of a sudden don't lose it or forget about it. So things can be like helping them to recognize natural reinforcers in multiple settings, like, how, teaching kids to ask themselves, how am I doing at this when I'm at recess or in the lunchroom? And I think this is a really key, not assuming generalization will occur naturally. Again, that you need to make sure that across all settings, students are capitalizing on the behavioral and academic and social skills that they need to be successful, and that they might not recognize that just because I was taught this in this one setting, I should also do it in this other setting of my day. That as teachers, we have to make sure that we are, again, scaffolding them for support to be successful across multiple settings, multiple parts of their school and life settings.
This is another great way that we see feedback be an important component of this. If you think about the work Hattie and Temperley do around feedback and the importance of feedback, self-feedback is an incredible component of that. And so when we allow students to attend to look inward to see how am I doing compared to, that also creates an opportunity for generalization that is independent, but it requires practice, right? So as we talked before about planning and thinking about chances for students to learn the skill, reflecting for yourself about whether did I accomplish the goal? Did I do the thing? Did this make sense to me? That's one of the ways that we can make students aware of their own progress through us, of course, scaffolding them to pay attention to those components. And that builds in these natural reinforcers and the reinforcement that comes just from the environment that sometimes students don't connect with automatically.
Yeah, really important point, Day. Thank you. We wanted to point out that CEDAR, as an OSEP funded center, we are natural partners with other OSEP funded centers that have a lot of resources pertaining to what we talked about today, including the Center on PBIS and NCII, which is the National Center on Intensive Interventions. Really great centers to also support you in your work. We are also going to send out this huge list of resources. So if you're an administrator or teacher educator, or you work with these individuals, we have some resources here that will be helpful. And then also resources for teachers that you can use around the various HLPs that we presented today.